Interesting topic because I think people come into mental health settings with all sorts of questions about, what to do, whether they're looking for therapy or medicine or other sort of holistic approaches. And the way that I always think about it is that, you want to make sure that you're getting information from the right places. I think that oftentimes these days, there is this push to sort of be positive, this kind of term toxic positivity coming into the vernacular. And I think that with anxiety, oftentimes there is a sense that anxiety is often not terribly rational, that sort of wouldn't it be nice if we could just sort of be positive and look on the bright side and not dwell in the negative and those kinds of things. And I think while those are really well-intentioned ideas, they don't often ultimately help people who are struggling. For many, many people, both Jung and Freud are incredible resources. They each have so much wisdom to offer. If you decide you want to read their work, there's no need in reality to choose between them. But I think historically there was a divide. People attach the heart to ideas of love and connection and these kinds of sort of experiences in life and images and so forth. And so I think for me with the heart, I was also drawn to writing about it because when you're anxious, one of the first signals that a lot of people physically experience is their heart rate increasing. And so it feels like this very direct link that we can tap into. There is this communication going on a chemical level all the time between our brains and our guts. And so I think the more that science can teach us about how our gut health influences and shapes our mental health, the better off we will be.
Welcome to your journey to find true tranquility with the Tranquility Magazine podcast with your host, Jasmine Maya Royce. Today's episode features. You can find more information about tranquility on our website, tranquilitymagazine.com.
Today, I'm super excited to have Dr. Alexandra Shaker. She is a licensed clinical psychologist with a background across inpatient and outpatient treatment settings. She has experience in research, teaching, and clinical practices. Dr. Shaker's writing is an indescribable exploration of the human condition. She integrates psychology, literature, history, anthropology, and the language to speak to the meaning and vitality we find in the stories we tell one another and the stories we tell ourselves. Dr. Shaker received her PhD in clinical psychology from the New School of Social Research and conducted her doctorate research at the Brief Psychotherapy Research Program. She completed her clinical training at the Columbia University Medical Center and the New York Presbyterian Hospital. Dr. Shaker also completed a postdoctorate fellowship in prenatal mental health at the Motherhood Center of New York, held a position there as a clinical psychologist and now a clinical consultant with her new book, The Narrowing, A Journey Through Anxiety and the Body. Welcome, Alexandra. Thank you for having the time.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here.
So my first question is always, what is your current mantra or state of mind?
I should have more mantras probably, but I think I would go with serenity now, as it's said in Seinfeld. So screamed, but
I do love Seinfeld. It is a very like a cultural understanding in so many ways that it always will make everybody laugh. And I think during the pandemic, I sat down to watch them all again.
Yes, absolutely. I think I might have done that too, actually, during the pandemic. Yeah.
It makes sense because it's always full of humor. And humor is a great resource to heal and understanding self.
Yeah.
So speak about why you have chosen the book's title, The Narrow,
Sure.
and what the background is about that term and phrase.
Sure. Well, I wanted the title of the book to be physically evocative of what anxiety feels like at a sensory level and in terms of the way that we think when we're anxious. And so I came across a definition of anxiety in this dictionary that sort of has kind of unusual ways of looking at terms. And they use this word narrowing in the definition of anxiety. And I thought it was really beautiful because it sort of it evoked this sense of narrowing focus, of kind of closing in on a subject if you're feeling sort of stuck on it when you're anxious, these kinds of thought-based experiences, but also this sort of internal sense of narrowing in the body, even things like blood vessels constricting when we're anxious, literally narrowing. And so when I was mulling over the title, I thought that that word really captured what it's like to be anxious.
Mm.
And I sort of ran it by some friends and colleagues who I thought would sort of be able to tell me honestly if they felt it had that effect. And they did. And so that made me feel sort of all the more confident that this word could capture the experience of anxiety at a glance.
Yeah, I mean, when I was like pontificating about it myself and the word as well and the meaning, because I'm guilty as charged being with anxiety, but I also kind of expanded it in a certain way that it was for the description you use, it sounds also like a panic attack that I'm guilty of. So I was like,
Absolutely.
woo, like I'm like, that
Yes.
really clear description of two things for me, but also related. So
Hmm.
I was experiencing the verbiage. I always think are so important. Words are so powerful, have very deep meaning, and we have different understandings for words that we choose sometimes to express ourselves or talk about things. There's a good example of like friendship means something to everyone differently and their relationship
Yes.
to
Yeah.
friendship. And that's a great word, but it's also like, how is our relationship to that word meaning to us individually?
Of course. I agree with you. And I think anxiety is a word that gets thrown around so much these days. And it's a word that can mean a really mild experience, and it's a word that can mean a really consuming experience, depending on who's using it. So I think being really specific about what anxiety is hugely important.
Yeah, I think also you did a lot of statistics currently in, our cultural demographic and the understanding of how much it's affected, our population, our environment. But can you expand a
Right.
little bit about what you found on
Yeah.
that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I was writing this book during the pandemic and kind of finishing it in the period of time when we sort of began to return to normal life in
Mm.
many ways. And so there's been a lot of interesting research about rates of anxiety, rates of depression. Of course, this has been the case before COVID began, but also in that context, in terms of how people responded to feeling isolated,
Mm.
out of their normal communities and routines and things like that. So I think we're in this period now where there's lots of data to suggest that there is, in fact, an increased rate of anxiety in many parts of the world. I don't mean to say that we can attribute that all to the pandemic at all, but that these numbers do seem to consistently suggest that anxiety is becoming a more common problem for people. I think it will probably take time to understand precisely why that's happening. I think there are probably many factors at play, like with most kind of social and cultural phenomena, there's probably far more than one reason. But I think that we're kind of at a point when, whether we're talking about adults or children or teenagers, we're seeing anxiety becoming a really pressing problem for many people.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree because I watched, not watched, but listened to a lot of my friends during the pandemic. I've had cabin fever before this, so I understand what's that. We're human. We need connection. We need to be some either introverted or extroverted. It didn't really matter. You still needed some kind of support or check-in. And for some, it was like deep work that they ended up doing. And just sometimes it just didn't, they couldn't compete with their own inner dialogue going on during the pandemic, where you don't have other resources to distract you, like your work or you're
Yeah.
in a family that you're spending too much time with or anything like that. It can be difficult. And I think it did a great disservice to a lot of people in a way that, it
Yeah.
was a trial course like spending alone time when nobody
Yes.
does really
Well,
get.
I think, yeah, I mean, you put it really well. I think when you say sort of like this experience of being kind of consumed with your own inner dialogue as a result a lot of circumstances, but I think there are some people who feel that way even today, even in the past, before we had this kind of forced period of isolation. And that is such a sort of accurate way to think about anxiety in many ways, that we become kind of consumed with internal concerns and fears that are very difficult to eliminate, despite sort of what might be rational, despite what other people might say, and so forth. So it was really amplified.
True. And like it was a great, experience to kind of check in, but not really the best experience to check in. It's like a forced check in. You're like, yeah,
Sure,
welcome
sure.
to you. Have you not talked to you today? um, so in your book, you kind of pair two very important figures, which is the first time I really have seen it in a book. And from my understanding and some interviews I've done is kind of pick a tribe, like one or the other, and not a combination. So I may be wrong on terming their overall, because they probably created themselves, a therapist or a psychologist, but Carl Jung and Freud are mentioned in both aspects throughout your book. So can you kind of dig deep on the understanding of bringing both to the picture?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, Jung and Freud remain incredibly important figures in psychiatry and psychology, as much today as ever, I think. But certainly it's interesting kind of thinking about differences in their work and in what people find especially fascinating about each of their work. I think for me, and I think for many, many people, both Jung and Freud are incredible resources. They each have so much wisdom to offer. If you decide you want to read their work, there's no need in reality to choose between them. But I think historically there was a divide in sort of in their circles and between them. But now I think there's no need to choose, and we can kind of read and be enriched by both of their work enormously. And I think certainly in my own education and how I think today, I don't particularly align myself with one or the other, but I really like to draw from each of them because, like I said, I think that I, like many people, believe they both have kind of an enormous wealth of wisdom in their work. So you can have both.
That's great to understand. I would say that's an expansive mind state. And I always
that's true.
with that idea that I don't like extremes or one way or the other for me in my own personal taste, journalistic background. And then you have to understand your biases and how it works. And then you have to write in the format that you are hired by or the demographic they're looking to relate to. But it makes you have more of an expansive understanding that it's not it's gray area rather than black and white. So you can figure out what is the benefit of both to utilize their experiences. And that's great understanding because, being too set in our philosophy, like our philosophy is kind of a stagnation, I would say sometimes for me, not specifically this, but, in that way that it's like expand your concepts and maybe it will work in your favor.
Yeah, I think we all have to have our own skepticism and read with that in mind. But at the same time, I think, like you say, like we can be expansive. We can see the wisdom in more than one perspective at the same time.
Yeah. And so I love that you've taken away so many aspects in your book. You pull from so many resources. I always love when people do that have like more fine-tuned, relatable like outlets. And you mentioned one specifically by Robert Burton. I don't know, I can't remember when specifically it was published, The Anatomy of Melancholy. But you did speak about some things that were coming forward in current like understandings about dandelion and herbal remedies that were related to that. You want to talk about it a little bit so people would know?
Well, sure. So The Anatomy of Melancholy is hundreds of years old. It's a beautiful book that is in many ways a collection of anecdotes and observations about so the term melancholy at that point was much broader than how we would think about it now. So it includes experiences that we would call anxiety today, for instance, among other things. And one of the things that Robert Burton includes in this book is the kinds of remedies that people were using or recommended to use for all sorts of physical and emotional problems. And so he includes in the book various herbal remedies, as you mentioned. I will tell you, I am no expert in herbal remedies. This is not my wheelhouse. Maybe it's your wheelhouse. So, but for me, I was just sort of fascinated from a historical perspective in terms of how people thought about health and, how to sort of address problem states in the body. So it was from that place that I was looking at it, but I can't claim any expertise in terms of herbal medicine or anything like that.
Yeah. So I totally understand that, but I love the reference to the understanding because it was back before pharma is a thing. So we're
Sure,
talking
yeah.
about a different timeline and where we
Yeah.
have pills from a manufacturer that is making stuff. And in my experience, a lot of our pharmaceutical remedies come from an herbal understanding. It comes from financial, and you can't mass produce something that's herbal that is readily available for the populace to make money. But it doesn't mean that, picking an herbal understanding, I would advise having someone else be your herbalist guide, and also understanding that can't heal everything if you have deeper trauma and stuff that needs to be addressed by a person like yourself, because otherwise it's not going to a cure all. Nothing really.
No, it's a really interesting topic because I think people come into mental health settings with all sorts of questions about, what to do, whether they're looking for therapy or medicine or other sort of holistic approaches. And, the way that I always think about it is that, you want to make sure that you're getting information from the right places. So for me, like I'm a psychologist, so we're not prescribers, so for me, the way that, so my training is in the sphere of Western medicine. So in my work, I would collaborate with psychiatrists or nurse practitioners and things like that. And I think if we always want to know the limits of our own knowledge, kind of. And so I'm always sort of, because herbal medicine isn't something I know about, it's not in my kind of area of comfort in terms of like training or knowledge base. And so most of my experience has been really kind of collaborating in more traditional Western medicine settings, but it's something I find very interesting understanding from these historical documents. It's fascinating to see what was being used. And I think for someone like you who has more knowledge now about what's available to people and what's being practiced and so forth, I can only imagine that reading the history has sort of a different layer of kind of connection or meaning for you.
Yeah, I always relatively understand like pulling from the history before, because a lot of things and information is lost in time. And there's different understandings when you pull a historical reference or somewhere else, because history tends to repeat itself in its own way. But to make it easier to understand, that you have to immerse to go back to find now. And sometimes I love those references that you have like formatted your book to have quite a few, because learn from what they experienced before so we can learn to grow better and, explore things. But I'm not saying that, just in general, it's great to reach to different resources in your journey of exploration to kind of find, little tidbits here and there that you're like, I never thought about it that way.
Well, and it's interesting, like, because you mentioned Robert Burton and the Anatomy of Melancholy. Part of what, and I write this in the book, but part of what's so incredible about reading the book is that even though the book is like 400 years old, the symptoms of anxiety that he kind of collects in the book are really close to the kinds of symptoms that people report today. They're worded a little bit differently. There's obviously some contextual differences that shift things, but there can be something very comforting, I think, about looking back in history and seeing, there are certain human struggles that have always been part of being alive, and they probably always will be.
I mean, that's also the truth of it. We are humans, and our human journey has been an exploration for everyone to kind of figure out how we can be who we are and better it. And, going back, because I was in the Western understanding for a long time, I became more of the Eastern ideas, just because that was a broader perspective, as we talked about before, on something that was so traditionally inclined for different cultures that it made an impart of their lifestyle and their understanding of health and well-being. But so your book, you pick out a lot for like every section, I would say, is very informative and specifically narrows down to aspects of, I guess I would say, anatomy. But I want to dive in to the first section in the idea of the elements of our body and how it relates to our positivity in current climates with the brain as a leading factor that you discuss, and how positivity is part of our understanding and utilizing that in a way you speak about anxiety.
I think that oftentimes these days there is this push to sort of be positive, this kind of term toxic positivity coming into the vernacular. And I think that with anxiety, oftentimes there is a sense that anxiety is often not terribly rational, that sort of wouldn't it be nice if we could just sort of be positive and look on the bright side and not dwell in the negative and those kinds of things. And I think while those are really well-intentioned ideas, they don't often ultimately help people who are struggling. And so I think that I wanted in my book to sort of look at the parts of ourselves that aren't so positive, the parts of ourselves that feel really painful and really hard to reckon with, that I think exist within everybody, rather than sort of leaning toward trying to correct for all of those elements of ourselves, if that makes sense.
It's very, I guess I would phrase it as a distraction method. Everybody wants to be positive and perfect. Let's get down to the brass tacks. We're not. Like when we want to like resonate at positivity and being like, I guess it pairs with my understanding of perfectionism. I was like, perfectionism doesn't exist. Anyone that's perfect is a lie. That's like, it doesn't exist at all. But also understanding that you can't put on a happy face when deep down inside, your ability to kind of tap in and tune into what you need hasn't been really fully embraced, healed, or focused on. So positivity is one of those aspects that it's a great idea, but you have to get there to get there.
Yes, you can't force it. And I think you're right. I think that there needs to be room for the parts of ourselves that don't feel positive in order to have any kind of authentic positive emotion. So sort of forcing it, I think, is a fool's errand, unfortunately. I mean, it would be great if we could all just be positive, but I have not seen that work out.
Yeah, I was like, you need to be a guru for that. So when it comes to blood in your section that you have, and the research that you've kind of discovered in a newer aspect of our circulation related to medication and how evolved at a better state to kind of understand the utilization of our blood as a expose on us, so to speak. So what was some of the things that you gathered about that understanding from your circulation?
Sure. So I think there's a few pieces. There's a lot of interest these days in using genetic testing to choose psychiatric medications sort of on an individual basis. This is kind of, it's not available to everybody. It's still becoming part of people's practice, but in some places it's becoming more widely known and widely used and widely available. And the logic of it is that by doing certain genetic testing, psychiatrists will be able to more accurately pinpoint which psychiatric medications will work and sort of take away some of the trial and error period that can be really hard when someone is really suffering and really symptomatic. And so that is one sort of interesting piece when it comes to sort of the blood and what we can learn from it as science rolls forward. I think another piece that occurs to me with your question is sort of this idea that we can measure inflammation through the blood, and there's research that's beginning to emerge, and I would call this very early nascent research. It's not, this is just starting to unfold, about how certain kinds of medications may may ultimately be anti-inflammatory in some respect, and
Mhm.
sort of beginning to understand a little bit more clearly how mood symptoms and inflammation may be connected. And I think I'm really curious about that line of research. I think it's really fascinating, beginning to understand more and more the role of inflammation in a lot of different medical conditions. And so I was for my book, I was of course like very focused on particular aspects of that, but I think understanding inflammatory processes in a lot of medical conditions is becoming something we're just learning more about. And I find that very exciting to understand.
Yeah, I think that's a very poignant aspect of our circulation and inflammation, which is
Mm,
most people are not even aware that they have inflammation and to
mm,
different degrees of inflammation and how it affects our mood, our abilities, and everything as aspects of our body and how our circulation changes our energy levels or our
mhm.
abilities. Blood
Yeah.
is, one of the most enlightening aspects, which you've defined really well in your sections. And then you
Thank
go
you.
to one of my favorites, the heart as
Mhm,
in tune,
mhm,
and the idea of the heart. And you kind of pulled a reference from Carl Jung in this, speaking about the idea of the combination of the heart and spirit, I guess if
mhm,
I'm saying right.
mhm.
And then
Yeah.
what were some of the takeaways that you kind of experienced when researching and understanding the collaboration between the two?
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I was really intrigued by thinking about, again, coming back to history and what we can learn from it, trying to look at different accounts of people's understanding of what different parts of our bodies did before we had kind of modern understandings of anatomy and physiology. And so, periods in history when people attributed attributes that we would think of as part of brain function to the heart, for
Mm,
example, things like that. And then of course now, people attach the heart to ideas of love and connection and these kinds of sort of experiences in life and images and so forth. And so
mm,
I think for me with the heart, I was also drawn to writing about it because when you're anxious, one of the first signals that a lot of people physically experience is their heart rate increasing. And so it feels like this very direct link that we can tap into to begin to pay attention to and understand our incredibly powerful link between how we feel in our
mm,
sort of emotional sphere and how we feel physically. Other kinds of links of that nature are more subtle and take, I think, longer to tap into, but the heart is pretty bold about it. We can all notice that really quickly. So for me, writing about the heart felt like it had to be part of the book because so many people with anxiety, panic, things like that first notice their heart racing, they're afraid they're having a heart attack. These kinds
yeah.
of things are just very, very common. So that's sort of how I approached that section initially.
Yeah, I think it's always an important aspect to kind of really understand the heart as an organ and what it is emotionally. Because you're like, they
Hmm.
say the mind is the thinking and the heart is the emotions and where some of the emotions live. But also, I've seen it and experienced that being in the music industry for a while and understanding how to sing and that emotivity that you have to draw from your emotions in order to make your lyrics really ring true and
Hmm.
to connect with people that way, you have to have those emotions that transpire that you pegged it well, that it's like a panic attack and you think you're having a heart attack and it's just like, how do I get out of this? Or
Hmm.
am I going to survive this? Like, is it going to
Hmm.
happen all the time? Like, how do I
Hmm.
remedy that?
Yeah.
But I also have been researching a little bit in my understanding about heart sickness. But when it comes to relationships, and so to speak, that you're looking for that validation or appreciation
Hmm.
from someone else and it doesn't
Hmm.
go to par, and
Hmm.
tapping into the heart area when it comes
Yeah.
to the anxiety that will come up out of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's a level of sort of like there's this element of mystery to it, I think, in some ways that, for a long, long time, humans have attributed this emotional center to the heart. And certainly on just sort of a very felt level, I think we all know what it feels like when you feel like, you're so joyful about something, your heart feels like it's swelling up almost. There's all
Mhm.
these sensory experiences we have that are connected to the heart. And I think some of them we can sort of tie to science, but some of them really do feel like these less tangible phenomena. And I think that's okay, And I think as far as sort of like heart sickness, I mean, there's a little bit in the book about Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, this idea that's been very much researched and seen in medicine, which sort of it is an actual cardiac condition that doctors can see and treat, that people will go to the hospital for sometimes, that often happens in the context of grief or heartbreak. So kind of like a classic example would be, you imagine a couple who have spent their entire life together.
Yeah.
Someone dies, and the person who remains is overcome with grief, and you sort of see these physical symptoms unfold. And so there is, I think if I had to sort of, I mean, when I think about the book in its entirety, and this is certainly true of the heart section, I think that it can be tempting, especially these days, to try to separate our mind's function and our body's function. But it's just not like that. It's all part of the same system. There's really no dividing them. And so I think in that context, these situations of physical symptoms emerging in response to a loss or grief make perfect sense.
Yeah. I think understanding your emotivity and, understanding your emotions, either learning to express them because you need to like either, physically dump them on someone else like yourself, that I signed up for like, this experience to have those moments that without judgment from someone else in your family, or bear too much on your friendships to have these moments that you're like, I don't feel like I can right now. And I feel like I'm in my own darkness that I have to figure out how to dig out of, and why your understanding is so important as well. And to have that as a resource for people to understand how to express and kind of talk through it for some. But it's also the idea that you pegged something, my understanding, the vagus nerve. Yeah, so that's like one that I've been exploring myself, in the idea that everything is connected by kind of a nerve, but nerves are part of your body's understanding, that it goes the whole spectrum, kind of all your lineage that, taps into every organ that you're talking about, and also in aspects of our circulation. So it's important to understand they all collaborate if we can understand them or connect with them.
Yeah.
So the gut is one of my favorites.
Oh, good. I'm glad you liked it.
One of my favorites, in a way that, it is trust your gut. I always say, trust your intuition that comes there, and understanding the gut is a kind of a conduit to a lot of, I guess I would relate in my understanding, like having indigestion is an emotional, like, in part. It's like, if you have indigestion, it may be emotional, it may be like thought process. So expand a little bit about what you've discovered and what you align with when it comes to the gut in your.
Sure. Well, in the section on the gut, I was really interested in the relationship between our mental health and our gut health. And there's lots of science around this. So it was just fascinating to work on this section for me, because it's such a rich area to study. And, for years now, the gut has been referred to in some scientific circles as the second brain. There have been books written for the public, if that's something you're interested in, that explore that really, really beautifully. So I would definitely recommend going into that direction if this is interesting to you. And basically, in basic terms, our brains and guts are in constant communication. That communication is bidirectional. So it's not just our brains communicating to our guts, it goes both ways. And so the experience of our guts changing in accordance with our emotional state is very much backed up by our biology. And so this, I think, is an area of research that I think will become even more powerful over time in terms of treatment, in terms of understanding causes of mental illness. One way that I've included in the book, that just to sort of like give you a little flavor for it, is, that we think of neurotransmitters that we hear about a lot, like serotonin and dopamine. We think of them as being in our brains, and they are, but they're also in our guts in large quantities. So there is this communication going on a chemical level all the time between our brains and our guts. And so I think the more that science can teach us about how our gut health influences and shapes our mental health, the better off we will be.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much depth and understanding in every section that you impart in your book to help with the overall understanding of how it impacts and resonated with anxiety, as well as a myriad of other things. But so what is a question that I should have asked or you had a takeaway from in this journey for healing your own inner work, but also out by the idea of anxiety and how it transpires and what maybe we can do about it a little bit?
Yeah.
Guys,
Yeah.
picking up your book.
What I hope people most take away, whether that's from this conversation or if they decide to read the book, which of course I would be delighted by, is that anxiety is, although anxiety can be very painful, anxiety can also be a powerful source of information. It can be a road to much more self-understanding. It is not something that we want to simply avoid, but something we can learn from. I don't mean to say that it's a lot of fun, because I think that would be unfair of me to say, but I think it's something that can be powerful and which I think ultimately can expand our lives. So if we go there, if we kind of, decide to try to understand it and look at the parts of our lives that are painful and difficult, I think we can actually live more fully and ultimately with a lot more joy and a lot more kind of meaningful, powerful connection to other people.
Yeah, I mean, that's signing up for some deep work. And that's part of being alive and living, giving yourself grace and understanding that you could be a better version of yourself by feeling better about yourself or understanding where the triggers or the elements come from and how you can protect, guard, and boundary up or shield up, as I say sometimes, to deal with aspects that come to your fruition that you have to now relive, re-deal with, or move through without having a panic attack, which is so much fun. I do love them. No,
Doesn't everybody?
Yeah, I mean, they're so enlightening, aren't they? I also think they're really important to kind of self-value that you're worth the journey. And you need to take care of yourself to understand that you're valuable enough. And everyone has the story that you talk about and their relationship with our own story and how we transpired to tell what our actual truth are. And to be vulnerable is important. And I think understanding that humble nature that is part of us in our entirety. But yeah. So my last two questions are always the first. What is the best advice you've ever received?
I think that's such a difficult question. I've received some very wonderful advice in my life, and I'm lucky to have had such wonderful teachers, but I will kind of stick with the theme and say, trust your instincts, pay attention to your instincts.
It's so important to understand that this is a generality and I could be entirely wrong because some people are gifted that women intuition is kind of how they already genetically operate. And men do have this ability and it's just as they can use it or understand it and learn to evolve it as well. But it's just part of our genetics in a way
Well, and I think many women are taught to ignore their instincts, unfortunately. And so it can there can be like this extra layer of kind of doing it differently, very deliberately.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately that is some of the most powerful advice and something I try to keep in mind. Really trust your instincts, pay attention to your instincts.
Yeah. You gotta have those gifts to understand how important they are, no matter your understanding of who you are as a, and that's important. But my last question is always, what is the most important takeaway from the hardest lesson you had to learn from?
Well, I mean, actually, not to be a broken record, but I think the experiences in my life that I have learned the most from, because I wish I had done them differently, generally are those in which I did not follow my instincts. So I would say that sort of learning from from wrong turns, I would only reiterate that we should really pay attention to our instincts. They can be incredibly powerful guides.
Yeah. I mean, totally feel you that I denied my intuition for a long time. That I'm like, no, that's not going to be an issue. No, I can't, or not. I hate the idea of judging people. I was like, this is not a good idea. I was like, and I'm like, no, it's okay. They're probably a nice person. I was like, I knew, but
that feeling is awful when you it's so hard when you, in retrospect, it's like, there was a part of me that knew something about the situation wasn't right or whatever, but I mean, live and learn, right? It's just how it is for all of us.
Yeah. We are like, anyone in the healing understanding that I have learned from my own exploration in the idea that we like to pick the hardest course.
I think that is true.
Yeah. Easy. We like to make it difficult because we want to be. In my mind, I try to say I wanted to get there faster. So I went through the hot moments consecutively going forward so I could get to the not destination, but the resolution and involvement. So, I like the harder course, and I'm sure you do too, because
it has, it's never boring. So there's that,
they have excitement. Well, thank you very much, Alexandra.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, for being here today. Please, everyone, pick up the Narrowing the Journey Through Anxiety and the Body. So pick up the book. It's very in-depth understanding our language for ourselves and others. And it was immense grace to have you, Dr. Alexandra Shaker. You can find all the bio information in the notes, and I'm blessed to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you for tuning in to the Tranquility Magazine podcast. Please subscribe and add your questions to our Q&A. We want to give a thank you to our team for their effort in creating every episode and our content at tranquilitymagazine.com.